And these experiences we've described, you were saying that it led you into linguistics, but it also led you into your view of politics and of the world. And you know, you're a libertarian anarchist, and when one hears that in the way issues are framed in this country, and we know why there's often so many misperceptions because of things that you've written. Help us understand what that means. In other words, well, it doesn't mean that you favor chaos or no government necessarily.
Well, remember, the United States is sort of out of the world on this topic. Britain is to a limited extent, but the United States is like on Mars. So here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it always meant in history. Libertarian, throughout modern European history, meant socialist and anarchist. It meant the socialist movement, the workers' movement and the socialist movement, sort of broke into two branches, roughly. One statist, one anti-statist. The statist branch led to Bolshevism and Lenin and Trotsky and so on. The anti-statist branch, which included Marxists, left Marxists, Pannekoek, Rosa Luxemburg, others, kind of merged more or less into an amalgam with a big strain of anarchism into what was called libertarian socialism. So libertarian in Europe always meant socialist. Here it means ultra, Ayn Rand or ultra Cato Institute or something like that. But that's a special U.S. usage having to do with a lot of things quite special about the way the United States developed, and this is part of it. There it meant, and always meant to me, socialist, anti-state, the anti-state branch of socialism, which meant a highly organized society, completely organized, and nothing to do with chaos, but based on a democracy all the way through. That means democratic control of communities, of workplaces, of federal structures built on systems of voluntary association spreading internationally. That's traditional anarchism. At least, anybody can have the word if they like, but it's a mainstream, probably the mainstream of traditional anarchism. And it has roots, coming back to the United States, it has very strong roots in the American working class movements. So if you go back to, say, the 1850s, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, so right around the area where I live, in eastern Massachusetts, textile plants and so on, the people working in those plants were in part young women coming off the farms. They were called factory girls. So the women come to the farms and work in the textile plant. Some of them were Irish, immigrants in Boston, and that group of people. They had an extremely rich and interesting culture. They're kind of like my uncle who never went past fourth grade. Very educated, reading modern literature. They didn't bother with European radicalism. That had no effect on them, but the general literary culture they were very much part of, and they developed their own conceptions of how the world ought to be organized. They had their own newspapers. In fact, the period of the freest press in the United States was probably around the 1850s. In the 1850s, the scale of the popular press, meaning run by factory girls in Lowell and so on, was scale of the commercial press, or even greater. And these were independent newspapers. A lot of interesting scholarship on them. You can read them now. They were not known, just spontaneously, without any background, and they never heard of Marx or Bakunin or anyone else. They developed the same ideas. They thought that from their point of view, what they called wage slavery, renting yourself to an owner, was not very different from chattel slavery, what they were fighting the Civil War about. And you have to recall that in the mid-19th century, that was a common view in the United States. For example, it was the position of the Republican Party. It was Abraham Lincoln's position. It's not an odd view that there isn't much difference between selling yourself and renting yourself. So the idea of renting yourself, meaning working for wages, was degrading. It was just an attack on your personal integrity. and they despised the industrial system that was developing, that was destroying their culture, destroying their independence, their individuality, constraining them to be subordinate to masters, there was a tradition of what was called republicanism in the United States. We're free people, you know, the first free people in the world. This was destroying and undermining that freedom. This was the core of the labor movement all over, and included in it was the assumption, just taken for granted, that those, I'm quoting, those who work in the mills should run them. In fact, one of their main slogans, I'll just quote it, was they condemned what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. That idea that you should, the new spirit, that you should only be interested in gaining wealth and forgetting about your relations to other people, they regarded as just a violation of fundamental human nature and a degrading idea. Well, that grew into, that was a strong, rich American culture, which was crushed by violence. The United States has a very violent labor history, much more so than Europe. And this was wiped out over a long period, but with extreme violence. By the time it picked up again in the 1930s, that's when I sort of personally came into the tail end of it. After the Second World War, it was just crushed. So by now it's forgotten. But it's very real. And see, I don't really think it's forgotten. I think it's just below the surface in people's consciousness.